knowing the fact that you have done this work on the ground, confronting all kinds of obstacles, people on all sides of the aisle politically, people with labels that it's very easy to call racist, who would be identified as part of the system of systemic racism, and yet you found a way to break through. And not just anecdotally or on a personal level, you found a way to break through and move the needle on criminal justice reform in the face of systemic racism. So for me, what you have done eclipses everything that we say systemic racism is intended to diminish. So I'd like your insight, Desmond, on how you took a path to confront systemic racism in the way that you did and to be so successful in doing so.
Wow. You know, just listening to you, and I'm reflecting on what we were able to accomplish and how you're talking about probably one of the most controversial topics, of voting rights to people with felony convictions in the most controversial state, the state of Florida. Yeah. Actually, it's 3 states. Some people say it's 3 states in one. At a time or in an environment that breathed hate, fear, division, right? But yet we were able to actually, I guess, dice through all of that and emerge from that cesspool, right, with a victory that was just shrouded in love, forgiveness, and redemption, right? Where we were able to actually have people from all walks of life, all political persuasions, actually support this, right? And I tell folks that we had over 5.1 million people who voted for, our amendment, and that's 1 million more than voted for any person on that ballot. And we know that at least 1 million people who voted for Amendment 4 also voted for our current governor, which shows a wide cross-section of support. And so those votes was not based on hate. They weren't based on fear. They were rather based on love. I think what was so important, right, was to be able to cut through, right? Now we acknowledge the racist history of felon disenfranchisement in this country. We acknowledge that. But we did not allow ourselves to be just defined just by that moment in history. Yes. But rather, we allow ourselves to actually expand that to include so many people, because the reality was, even though the original intent of felon disenfranchisement was specifically to target newly freed slaves, yes, right? The reality is, like a tumor left unchecked, it would grow throughout the rest of the body, and now everyone is infected, right? Absolutely. And so we were able to actually now show that there was like so much interconnectivity, which in a sense helped kind of knife through the racism, because the racism is really a limited sense of thinking, right? So we were able to actually elevate above that. And what transcends the racism to me is love. Yes. Right? And so be able to connect these people with someone who they loved, who was impacted by the system, and have them mobilize and organize around that with that thought in their head. And so it wasn't a primal response that was triggered in people when they thought about criminal justice, they thought about African Americans. No, when they thought about criminal justice, they thought about someone who they loved, right? And that's who they stood up for, and that's who they fought for. And we were able to be successful because of that.
First of all, I just think that is such a brilliant analysis and strategy in terms of how we build effective mass-based movements for justice, for social justice and human rights. And when you were saying that, I was just thinking of how Operation New Hope, Kevin, being aligned with the same principles of social justice, the same principles of restorative justice. And the work you've been doing and how we went to South Africa and Dr. Mandela was absolutely overwhelmed. As we're looking at these protests and the whole idea of systemic racism, how has it impacted you? What has occurred to you in this historic moment with this incredible challenge to face racism like we never have before?
Well, kind of going back, so we started 21 years ago, right? When we began to do our work here in the urban core. And you used the word earlier, Desmond, which I think is so powerful, that proximity. We have to have something that either pulls us or somehow we have this ability to get closer. Sometimes it's by accident, sometimes it is through the connection of love. It happens in a number of different ways. You don't even know how that systemic structural racism builds itself through conversation, by observance of other people that you love and that you hold in such high regard, acting in a way. And it's not necessarily that really horrific thing. It's the little subtleties, the nuances of not saying something, or wow, you were in a conversation and you didn't challenge somebody on that. And that is something that as you grow older and you're around that part of it. And so all of that was embedded in me. And so I went to a high school that had one African American in my graduating class. I had no relationship to understand any of the issues and the pain and the struggle, you would get in relationships of friends. And so 21 years ago, I went to my boss and I said, my dad, and I said, look, I just need to do something. I need some time to kind of explore some ideas. And that's when we started Operation Hope in 99. But I didn't know really anything, from the standpoint of these issues. And we started building houses. Initially, it was just about creating affordable housing. I didn't understand the nuances around what we had done, some of the components of systemic racism, what banks had done to redline. This area we're sitting was one of those areas. African Americans had to walk around this community, back 70 years ago. But now we were building houses here that were both, primarily for people of color. But what I began to see, what our organization began to see, was just all of the component pieces that had been born. I didn't know anything about the criminal justice issue, one of the other components of that systemic piece that I experienced in a big way. But when we began to do the credit to look at how we could get families and families of color into housing that we were building in urban core, just the impact of not having health insurance, and you have a kid or a family member that goes to Shands Hospital or goes to one of the hospitals with an emergency and then has a $80,000 bill that nobody's paying, and what stays on the credit for their entire life. Yes. And nobody has really acknowledged the fact, because of healthcare, now they've got a blemish that precludes somebody from having that American dream, the dream of home ownership. Yes. But we got to see that in the thousands of families that we worked with. That was one of the major components. And so, these are the little things that are, that are hitting. But what got me the most was, I began, as we were building these houses, we'd see every single day these young men and women, and a lot of people of color, were coming and saying, hey, do you need any help? Can we work on your job? And we would bring them on, because we were nonprofit and we were trying to rebuild a community, bring folks in. And then in time, to your point on that proximity piece, I was hearing the same story that these young men were telling me about. I'd say, well, why aren't you working anywhere? Tell me a little bit. Well, I had a charge 3 or 4 years ago or 2 years ago, and people won't hire me. I'm like, what? Right, duh. But I kept hearing that story over and over again, and it really touched me. So I went back to the board and said, look, there's something powerful going on here, because what I learned is if I took on and brought in a young man and they worked for a couple of weeks, I could pick up the phone and call anybody in town, any contractor, and said, hey, by the way, I've got John over here, young man. He's got a record, but he's been showing up every day on time. Oh, see him right now. Right. Now, if John would have gone and called on that guy on his own, on the slim to none, we know where that would have been. Right. And so I began to see, wow, just how hard it is to break, right? And also I said, for whatever reason, we had the ability to advocate on behalf of those who didn't have an advocate. And it empowered us. I mean, our board, we ended up starting a nonprofit construction company so we could control our own destiny. We could hire who we wanted to hire. And that's when we began this move. But I got to tell you, it really touched my heart in the most incredible way, because I saw all these young men who were just like me.